topic that is about the mode of actions of adrenal hormones and regulatory mechanism of adrenal hormones. In previous lectures, we have basically discussed about the synthesis of adrenal hormones, and we have also discussed a little parts about the genomic pathway and non-genomic pathway of adrenal hormone actions. So let us continue the rest of the part of adrenal gland. As we already know, there are a number of hormones that are secreted from different parts of adrenal glands. Some of the hormones are secreted from the cortex region and some are for medullary regions. So here, the secretions of all those hormones are regulated by different factors. So in today's discussions, we will focus into what are the most important factors that regulates the secretions of all those hormones, right? And after that, we will also discuss about the most important physiological actions of all those hormones. See here, as you already know, the most important type of mineralocorticoids is the aldosterone. And these aldosterone are secreted from this cortex area, right? Mainly the dona glomerulosa cell layer. Here, if you see the most important functional features of these mineralocorticoids or aldosterones, you will find this is mainly involved with the two major functions. So what is the two major functions that is carried out by aldosterone? Mainly it involves the reabsorptions and excretions. As the terms denotes the mineralocorticoids, it means it involves the regulation of certain types of minerals, right? So what type of minerals here? These are sodium ions and potassium ions. And the most important thing is where actually the mineralocorticoids act, or what is the site of actions of mineralocorticoid, right? So most important site into which the aldosterone or mineralocorticoids acts is the kidney, mainly the distal part of our distal convoluted tubule or collecting duct of the kidney, right, or nephron. So what is the most important functional features that is carried out by these aldosterone hormones? It involves increase in the reabsorption process of sodium ions, right? It involves increase in the excretion of potassium ions from distal renal tubules. See here, in case of first ones, there is a reabsorption, and reabsorption basically occurs from the tubule to the blood plasma, right? Whereas the increased excretion depends on the number of potassium ions moves from the blood plasma to the tubule first, and after that from the tubule there is a high level of excretions of that particular potassium ion. Along with this, you can see there is an increased excretion of potassium proton ions, that is also from distal renal tubules, and there is an increase in water reabsorptions along with the sodium ions. Other than these reabsorptions of both the sodium and waters or excretion of potassium and proton ions, another important functional features that is also carried out by these hormones, that is decreased sodium contents into sweat, saliva and other secretions, right? All this, both the sodium reabsorptions and potassium excretions along with the absorption of or reabsorptions of water actually helps to maintain the blood pressure, right? Overall, we could say the aldosterone is very important hormones. It not only involves the reabsorptions of minerals, it not only involves the excretion of minerals, it also involves the reabsorption of water by reabsorbing both the sodium and water by excreting potassium, and it helps to regulate the blood pressures. Now you can see from here, this is the adrenal glands, and these adrenal glands secretes aldosterone hormones. When it positively stimulates the cells, mainly the epithelial cells that is present into the distal convoluted tubule, right? When these aldosterones acts into those cells present into the distal convoluted tubules, there is a increased reabsorption of sodium and reabsorption of water, along with the excretion of potassium ions. Other than this, you also can see aldosterone not only act into the distal convoluted tubule, it also shows some other functions. So what is the other functions? You can see aldosterone stimulates the vasoconstriction, right? Mainly vasoconstriction occurs into the arterioles, right? Due to the vasoconstrictions in the arterioles, there is a changes in the blood pressures, right? You also can see, other than this, the aldosterone, or indirectly you could say there is another important molecules that is involved in the regulations of this aldosterone action. This is called angiotensin II. It also acts in a particular size of pituitary, mainly the posterior sections of the pituitary. From the posterior sections of pituitary, it stimulates the secretions of ADH that ultimately helps to maintain the reabsorption of water into a particular site, mainly the collecting duct. So it means, other than these functions that is carried out by aldosterone hormones, there is some other functions also controlled by the same hormone. Now you can see the locations here. There is a reabsorption of sodium ions, and there is more and more amounts of excretions of potassium ion, and it is only due to the functions of aldosterone hormone. See, since the aldosterone is very, very important in several physiological point of view, so we can say under certain conditions, it may shows a different mode of actions. So what is the conditions here? The conditions, you can say, in absence of these particular hormones. Suppose there is a total absence of these particular aldosterone hormones. How it affects the physiological systems? So due to the absence of these hormones, there is a changes in the retentions of potassium ions, right? It means there is an increased retentions of potassium ion. Whenever the aldosterone is available, what we have seen there is a higher level of excretions of potassium ion. But here, when aldosterone is absent, it leads to increase in the retentions of potassium ions. Not only the retentions of potassium ions, at the same time, there is a depletions in the level of sodium ion. So what we have seen in the normal conditions? In normal conditions, there is a reabsorption of sodium ion. But in the abnormal conditions, there is a depletions of sodium ions, right? And along with this, there is a decrease in the chloride ion also, and both the ions, when sodium ions and chloride ions, that was found very lesser in amount in the blood plasma. Here you can see, due to the changes in these potassium ions, sodium ions and chloride ions, it directly affects the blood volumes, right? So decrease in the blood volumes further reduces the cardiac changes. Mainly, it reduces the cardiac output. So it also shows some other physiological effects. So what is the effects? It causes increase in the level of potassium, and due to the increased level of potassium ions in the blood plasma, it shows some cardiac toxicity, including the weakness in the heart contractions and development of arrhythmia. So simple thing is, under certain conditions, mainly whenever there is a normal secretions of aldosterone, it helps to maintain the reabsorptions of both the sodium and water. It helps to maintain the normal excretions of potassium ions along with the chloride ions. But whenever there is a total absence of this particular aldosterone hormones, what we have seen, It just alters the retention capacity, where the more and more amount of potassium retention takes place, whereas there is a depletion of sodium ions that is found into the extracellular fluid or blood plasma. Now, in some other conditions, if you see the physiological impact, what we see? When the level of aldosterone is very high, it causes the development of hypokalemia. So what is the physiological basis of hypokalemia, right? In these particular conditions, there is a decrease in the potassium ion concentrations. As you know, in normal conditions, there is a higher excretions. But in hypokalemic states, there is a decrease in the potassium ion concentrations. And due to the decrease in the potassium ion, we know the potassium ion as well as the sodium ions, both are very much important to maintain the electrical impulse transmissions. But what we see is, due to the changes in this potassium ion concentrations, it affects the normal electrical excitability of the nerve cell, right? And along with this, it also affects the muscle fibers that prevents the propagations of the action potentials, right? So this is what is the physiological effect of hypokalemic state, and this is what is the physiological effects whenever there is a high level of aldosterone. Now, if you see in other conditions, you may find some mild alkalosis. So what is the physiological basis of the development of this mild alkalosis, right? Whenever there is increased excretions of hydrogen ion along with the hypokalemia, both the conditions causes the changes in the pH, changes in the blood pH, right? And ultimately the development of alkalosis. So here hypokalemia, which is a conditions of the decreased potassium ion, not only the part of the decrease of the potassium, this decreased potassium also affects some other physiological events like effects in the nerve muscle physiology. Along with this, with the changes in the hydrogen ion concentrations, there is a changes in the blood pH that leads to the development of alkalosis. So if you see the concentrations of secretion of this particular hormones in a different point of time, you will find some differences. So you can see aldosterone secretions follows a cyclic patterns. So what is that cyclic patterns? The cyclic patterns is, if you see the concentrations, it is reached the peak levels during the morning hour. At the same time, if you see or if you measure the aldosterone hormones or blood aldosterone hormones, you will find the lowest value of at that particular hormones during night. So it means the regulations of the secretions also involves cyclic events, which helps to maintain the optimum concentrations of hormones in different point of time. Now, as you know, these aldosterone hormones or hormones secreted from adrenal glands shows two different mode of actions: genomic actions and non-genomic actions. So what is the genomic actions here, or what are the most important receptors by which these aldosterone hormones acts? As you know, the aldosterone hormones is steroid in nature. The most important receptors for these aldosterone hormones is the MR receptors. Now question is, what is the locations of these MR receptors and how these MR receptors helps to maintain the functions of these aldosterone hormones? See here, this is the distal convoluted tubules. Here in these distal convoluted tubules, there are certain types of principal cells or epithelial cells. In the epithelial cells, if you see the cytoplasms of these epithelial cells, there are some types of receptors. These are called MR receptors. And these MR receptors is very, very specific for aldosterone, which is attached to the heat shock proteins, right? But once this aldosterone binds to these MR receptors, there is a detachment of these heat shock proteins from these MR receptors. So what is the exact basis of this genomic pathway? You can see this is the interstitiums where aldosterones are present. So due to the higher concentrations of this aldosterone, it diffuses into the cells or in cell cytoplasms. In cell cytoplasms, there is a specific receptors called MR receptors, and these MR receptors are specific for aldosterone only. Once aldosterone binds, it moves towards the nucleus. As we know, in the nucleus or in the gene segments, there is a hormone response elements. With this complex binds. Once this complex binds with this hormone response elements, there is a alterations in the expressions of the genes, and alterations of expressions leads to the formations of messenger RNA. Ultimately, the translations of this messenger RNA produce some proteins. Up to this is clear. Now, as I mentioned, this distal convoluted tubules mainly involve with the reabsorptions and excretions purpose. So, reabsorptions means reabsorptions of sodium and water and excretions of potassium and chloride. Now, for the reabsorptions of both the ion, there must be some transporter or channels, right? And that channel must be activated channel so that the reabsorptions can take place, right? So here the proteins that is synthesized after the translations of this mRNA are nothing. This is the sodium potassium ATPase pump, right? And this sodium potassium ATPase pumps or sodium potassium ATPase, which is a protein, due to the presence of this protein, it activates this channel, right? This channel is basically epithelial sodium ion channel, ENAC, right? And this epithelial sodium ion channel helps in the absorption process, right? Other than this, there is activations of the potassium ion channel also. And the activations of both these channels depends on the presence of this protein. What is the name of these proteins? These proteins actually sodium potassium ATPase proteins. And these proteins are synthesized after the translations of this mRNA. And mRNA is synthesized when this membrane receptor complex bind with this hormone response elements segments of the genes, right? Now, once there is activations of all these ion channels, how they help to absorptions and or reabsorptions and excretions. Here you can see, due to the presence of these ion channels, chi sodium ions reabsorbs into the blood plasma, along with there is an entry of 2 potassium ions, right? So here both things happens together, right? So here, as I already mentioned that aldosterone, the most important functions of the aldosterone is the reabsorptions of sodium and excretion of potassium. So, but both the reabsorptions and excretions depends on the activity of a certain types of ion channel. Here ion channel is this, but activations of this ion channel again depends on the presence or availability of this sodium potassium ATPase pump or sodium potassium ATPase, because this sodium potassium ATPase provides energy during the transport of 3 sodium ions along with 2 potassium ions, right? Here, what are the other changes takes place here? You can see expression of sodium channels for uptake of sodium ions in the tubular lumen gets enhanced, thus increasing the permeability of the apical membranes for sodium absorption, right? You can see whenever there is a higher level of expressions of the sodium channel, obviously there will be more and more number of sodium channel available, so that sodium ion easily can pass through the channel, and that helps to maintain the proper amount of reabsorptions of sodium ions. So it means the proper number of sodium absorptions totally depends on the expression of sodium channel that are located into the apical membrane. Other than this, increased rate of ATP synthesis, genes transcriptions for meeting energy demands. Obviously, as it is a co-transport mechanisms, sodium potassium co-transport, and this co-transport needs energy. So that energy is provided by this ATP synthase. So before providing the ATP by ATP synthase, it must be produced by the expression of ATP synthase gene. So here it is the increased level of expressions of ATP synthase gene, so that sufficient ATP will be available for the transport of both the sodium and potassium. Other than this, expressions of genes coding for sodium chloride co-transporters. So obviously, if there is a higher level of expressions of these co-transporters, obviously there will be a transport, more and more transport of sodium and chloride through these transporters. It needs the expressions or higher level of expressions that ultimately helps to maintain the electrochemical balance, right? At the same time, expressions of sodium proton exchanges in proximal colon. Now, up to this, if you see the concentrations of these transporters, they are basically located into the distal convoluted tubules. But if you see the concentrations of these transporter proteins, that are they are concentrated into the proximal sections of the colons, right? That basically reporters to be controlled by the aldosterone. So as I mentioned, aldosterone controls the absorptions into the collecting duct. Here there are some reported study. It not only controls the secretions or functions of aldosterone into the collecting duct, it also controls the actions of aldosterone into the proximal colon, right? So overall, we could say all these causes increase in the renal and colonic sodium water reabsorptions along with the increased potassium excretions, right? So here, this reabsorption and excretions of potassium are well controlled, which is expressed by explaining the genomic pathway. But as we know, there is another pathway via which aldosterone also connect. That is the non-genomic actions or non-genomic pathway. So what is the non-genomic pathway? If you see the actions of aldosterone, it takes very minimum time whenever aldosterone hormones acts through non-genomic pathway. It needs seconds to minutes only to act into the target cell in comparison to the genomic pathway. So what is the basis of the non-genomic pathway? Like other hormones, non-genomic pathway acts through the second messenger systems. It involves the cyclic AMP formations. It involves the synthesis of calcium ions, right? I am not explaining in details about the non-genomic pathway, but this part is very important. Also, you can see there is a increase in the intracellular calcium ion concentrations along with the rapid stimulation of proton conductance of the plasma membrane and leads to the increased pH of cytosols. Other than this, you can see this non-genomic pathway leads to the increase in the formation of cyclic AMP, and this non-genomic pathway basically prevalence in a particular type of cells, mainly the vascular smooth muscle cells as well as the epithelial cells in the renal tubules. So, no need to explain in details about the non-genomic pathway as it is the common pathway for all the steroid hormones. So, in non-genomic pathway, most important thing is it acts to second messengers. Either it produces second messenger cyclic AMP or it produces diacylglycerol, but here in this case it produces a cyclic AMP and it also increases the calcium ion molecules, and both the cyclic AMP and calcium ion molecules helps us to maintain the mode of actions of aldosterone through non-genomic pathway. Now, here the aldosterone action depends on several other factors. Aldosterone actions depends on some important protease enzymes. That actions can be explained by explaining a specific system. The name of that system is called renin angiotensin aldosterone system. So now we will explain how this renin angiotensin aldosterone systems involves with the regulation of aldosterone secretions, involves with the action of aldosterone. As we know, aldosterone is a steroid hormone, but these steroid hormone actions are influenced by several other biomolecules. Now, question is, what are those molecules and from where they are synthesized and how they affects the action of aldosterone? You can see the most important site from where a peptide are synthesized is the liver. The name of that peptide is angiotensinogens. We are explaining here how the renin angiotensin systems or renin angiotensin aldosterone systems helps to maintain the balance of aldosterone secretion, right? You can see the most important things here is the renin, right? And what is the role of renin? I will explain. Other than renin and angiotensin, another important things also involved in this system, that is called as ACE, that is called angiotensin converting enzymes. These three angiotensin converting enzymes, renin and angiotensin, they all are produced from three different parts of the body. Here renin is secreted from kidney, angiotensinogens from liver, and angiotensin converting enzymes is from lungs, right? Now, all these three how acts together to maintain the function of aldosterone. Generally, if you see the chemical features of this angiotensinogens, it is basically an inactive peptide. The activations of this inactive peptide depends on the availability of the renin, right? And these renin are secreted or produced by kidney. And once renins are produced, it sends a positive stimulatory signal to the angiotensinogens. That helps to convert these angiotensinogens to the angiotensin 1, right? It is a decapeptide, right? So the conversions of these angiotensinogens to angiotensins fully depends on the availability of this renin only. The availability of the renins obviously depends on the proper or optimum functions of our kidney. Now, along with this, whenever angiotensin once are formed, it enters another step of biochemical reactions. And that biochemical reactions is catalyzed by specific type of enzyme. And the name of that enzyme is angiotensin converting enzymes. The role of this angiotensin converting enzyme is the conversions of angiotensin 1 to angiotensin 2, right? So here, the angiotensin 2 is very, very important. So how this angiotensin 2 is important? Angiotensin 2 is important because it acts in different pathway that helps to maintain the reabsorptions of minerals, excretions of minerals. So you can see the presence of activated form of angiotensin 2 send a positive stimulus to a sympathetic nerve that helps to improve the sympathetic activity of the nerve cell. Angiotensin 2 also involves in the ADH secretion. Whenever angiotensin 2 is available, it sends positive signals to the pituitary. Pituitary releases ADH, and this ADH is very, very essential in the reabsorptions of water. And these reabsorptions takes place in the collecting duct of renal tubule. Other than this sympathetic activity and ADH secretions, you can see this angiotensin 2 stimulates our adrenal cortex to release more and more amount of aldosterone, right? So it means the secretions of aldosterone depends on angiotensin 2, And this activated form of angiotensin 2 or activations of this angiotensin 2 depends on sufficient supply of renin, availability of the enzyme and conversions of these angiotensinogens to angiotensin 1. Now here angiotensin 2 helps to secrete this aldosterone. Once aldosterone is available, it directly acts into the distal convoluted tubule for the reabsorptions of minerals along with the water, as well as the excretions of some other ions like chloride and potassium ions. An important feedback systems helps to maintain the balance of both the sodium reabsorptions and potassium excretions. So this is the feedback systems. However, there is more and more amount of sodium's presence in extracellular fluid or blood plasma. It needs to maintain the optimum level. So in that point of time, it sends a negative signal to the kidney, right? This negative signal, whenever it reaches to the kidney, it prevents the formations of renin. Ultimately, it blocks the conversions of the first reactions. There will be no available angiotensin 2, no further changes will happen into the kidney. So this is how aldosterone hormones secretions are regulated, and this is how aldosterone acts into the reabsorption and excretion process. You can see this reabsorptions of sodium, reabsorptions of waters ultimately helps to maintain another important physiological events. So how it is important? Due to the normal reabsorptions of all those ions, it helps to maintain the blood pressures. It improves the blood pressures as well as it improves the blood volumes, and it continues until it reaches the normal state. So you could say the regulations of normal blood pressures and normal blood volumes are controlled by renin-angiotensin system. To maintain the normal blood pressures and normal blood volume, it not only maintained by renin-angiotensin systems, we could say there is a significant role of aldosterone hormones to maintain the normal or optimum pressures and optimum blood volume. Other than this, there are some other factors that also involves in the regulation of aldosterone secretions. One is renin-angiotensin systems. So what are the other factors that helps to maintain the aldosterone secretions? You can see mainly the ACTH. It involves in the regulation of aldosterone secretions, and also it depends on increased potassium ion concentrations into the extracellular fluid and increased sodium ion concentrations. Means other than this angiotensin systems, some other factors also involved. Now, all these factors like potassium ion, sodium ion, renin-angiotensin system, ACTH, they stimulate the aldosterone secretions. But there are some other molecules that inhibit the secretions. So what is that molecules and how they inhibit the secretions? You can see the most important peptide called atrial natriuretic peptide or ANP, right? What is the role of this ANP? It is the only inhibitor for the synthesis of aldosterone, right? Before that, what we have discussed, all these stimulate the secretions of aldosterone. But here, ANP inhibits the synthesis of aldosterone. Now, how it inhibits the aldosterone secretions and what are the other role of ANP here? You can see ANP is a peptide hormones, and these peptide hormones secreted from a particular cell of our cardiac systems. Mainly, it is secreted from atria, and the secretions of this ANP depends on the level of blood pressures and level of blood volume. Whenever there is an elevated blood pressures or elevated blood volume, it directly, our atria or cells of atria secretes this ANP, right? And after the secretions of ANP, how it acts? See, increased ANP inhibits release of renin. You can see from here, there is a secretions of ANP from atria, and once ANP available, it ultimately leads to the reduced level of renin. And this renin are basically synthesized from JG apparatus of our nephron, right? Available ANP leads to reduced level of renin. If renin level is reduced, obviously it directly or indirectly hampers this pathway, right? If renin is not available, obviously there will be no further conversions of these angiotensinogens, no formations of aldosterone. So this is how it inhibits the aldosterone secretions. Now, see, due to the abnormal formations of renin or reduced level of renins, how it physiologically important. See, whenever renin is low, obviously there will be low level of angiotensin II as well as low level of aldosterone. This low level of angiotensin II and low level of aldosterone increase the filtration rate, right? On the other hand, along with the atrial natriuretic peptides, there is another peptide called brain natriuretic peptides. They together helps to maintain the diameters of the blood vessels. They causes vasodilatations. So ultimately leads to the decrease in the blood pressures in the blood vessels, right? They not only involves to the reductions of the blood pressures. Whenever there is an increased rate of GFR, there is an increased natriuresis as well as more urine formations called diuresis. In natriuresis, you can see, in natriuresis, there is an increased sodium excretion in the urine. Increased sodium excretions. What we have seen, what is the role of aldosterone hormones? It helps to absorb the sodium ion. But here, due to the presence of this ANPA, it increases the sodium excretions. So it means into the blood plasma or in extracellular fluid, there will be low sodium ion. Instead, there will be high sodium ion into the urine. So if sodium ion is high in the urines, that is called natriuresis. And if you see the level of urines, there will be more and more urine formations due to the hyperactivity of GFR called diuresis. That diuresis ultimately leads to the decrease in the blood volume. Now, here we could say this ANPA not only prevents the release of renin, it also helps to maintain the blood volume and it also helps to maintain the blood pressures. Mainly, it reduces both the blood volumes and blood pressures. Now, another important hormones called the glucocorticoids, mainly the cortisols. That is also a steroid hormones. I am not going into the details as it is steroid hormones. Obviously, it will act on the nuclear receptors and activations of the gene segments ultimately produce some proteins, and these proteins leads to changes in the cellular response, right? As we already know about that. Here we will discuss how this cortisol, like aldosterone, cortisol is also very important for us. Here cortisol is a glucocorticoid. The most important functional features of this cortisol hormone is the metabolism. So, what type of metabolic activities are controlled by this cortisol hormone? You can see the most important site in which cortisol hormones act are muscle cell, liver and adipose tissue. In all those cells, cortisol hormone regulate the metabolic activities, right? You can see in muscle cells, there is a catabolism that leads to the breakdown of muscle protein and productions of more and more amount of amino acids. But in case of adipose tissue, there is an increased level of lipolysis, means breakdown of lipid molecules. the breakdown of lipid molecules produce more and more number of free fatty acids, right? Whenever both the amino acids and free fatty acids are available, in presence of cortisol hormones, it stimulates another metabolic activities that occurs into the liver, mainly gluconeogenesis. Here, what is gluconeogenesis? Gluconeogenesis means the formations of glycogens from non-glucose substance. That is a structural compositions of proteins, free fatty acid, or it is a structural compositions of lipids. Both are non-protein substance. So here, the formations of glycogens by the process of gluconeogenesis are influenced by the cortisol hormones. So here, due to the gluconeogenesis, there is a formations of more and more amount of glycogens into the livers. Now see, increased level of glycogens into the livers, alters the metabolic activities of insulin. So how it affects the insulin activity? See here, as I mentioned, cortisols, the main functions of cortisols is the metabolisms of carbohydrate, protein and fat. The metabolism of protein takes place in the muscle cell and metabolism of fats takes place in the adipose tissue. Metabolisms of both the proteins and fats produce some non-protein substance. Here, these are amino acids and fatty acids, and gluconeogenesis is the process of the formations of glycogens from non-protein substance. Here, this is the non-protein substance. So ultimately leads to the formations of glycogens. And these glycogen formations, or more and more glycogen formations in the livers, are influenced by the availability of the cortisol hormones. Now, when the level of glycogens is very high in the livers, it alters the metabolic activities of insulin. Generally, we know the insulin helps to maintain the blood glucose levels, right? But here, due to the high level of glycogens in presence of cortisol, it causes the development of insulin resistance. Means, insulin resistance means insulin is not able to absorb the blood glucose. So that into the circulatory blast, there will be more and more glucose. Because there is a disturbance in the function of insulin, right? And we know the insulin is mainly involved with the absorptions of blood glucose. But high level of glycogens in presence of cortisol, it prevents the absorptions of glucose because there is a insulin resistance. So now, here in the circulatory blast, there is a high level of glucose. And this presence of this higher level of glucose ultimately helps in the glycolytic events. And these glycolytic events produce the energy, right? As we know, the breakdown of glucose gives us energy. So this is how cortisol is important. This is how the cortisol involved with the metabolism of carbohydrate, protein and fat. These cortisol hormones shows their actions under certain conditions. Here you can see there is a conditions, stress conditions. So how this cortisol hormone behaves in these conditions? You can see the actions of cortisols in two different ways. Short-term stress response and long-term stress response. In both the case, this cortisol hormones actually alters the metabolic activities. If you see this one, in presence of prolonged stress, there is a secretions of ACTH from pituitary, and this ACTH helps to reduce, helps to secrete both the mineralocorticoid as well as the glucocorticoid. Here we are explaining about the cortisols, which is a glucocorticoids. So here, stress conditions causes the secretions of ACTH that alters the secretions of glucocorticoid from adrenal glands, and available glucocorticoid ultimately shows some stress response. What are those stress response? The stress response are proteins and fats converted to glucose or breakdown for energy, means metabolisms. Increased blood glucose, as I already mentioned. As well as another important functions that is controlled by cortisol hormone during stress conditions is suppression of immune system. Right? So these are some important physiological functions of cortisol hormone. Other than this cortisol hormones acts in several other important organs. You can see, due to the presence of these cortisol hormones, it improves the heart rate, it causes the increase in the vasoconstrictions, the blood vessels, there is an increase in the fat metabolisms, protein metabolism takes place, and to skeletal muscles, metabolism of carbohydrate in the livers, and along with this, there is a increased secretions of ADH. That is very essential because it maintains the water reabsorptions. It also involves with the immunosuppressions. It shows anti-inflammatory property, and it also involves with the control of neural actions. Other than this, cortisol shows permissive actions. Permissive actions means whenever cortisol presence, then only catecholamine shows its activity. Without cortisols, catecholamines cannot. So it is called permissive actions. So these are several site of actions for cortisol hormones. Now, what is the mechanisms, the regulations of secretions of cortisols? Yes, there is a negative feedback control, by which there is a regulations of, cortisol hormone secretions can be regulated. Obviously, this is the conditions, stress conditions, or whenever there is a low level of blood glucose into the flowing blood. These conditions stimulates hypothalamus, causes increase the release of releasing hormone, that is corticotropin releasing hormone, that ultimately acts to the anterior pituitary, which improves the secretions of ACTAs, which is essential for adrenal glands, and ultimately adrenal gland secretes the glucocorticoids. If you see the level of cortisol hormones into the blood, there is a high level of cortisol hormones. Now question is, whenever there is a more and more cortisols in the circulatory blood, it needs to prevent the secretions of this. So how it prevents? High level of cortisols prevents the secretions of cortisols in two different levels. It directly can inhibit the secretions of CRH from hypothalamus. It also can prevent the secretion of ACTH from anterior pituitary sections. So this is how this hypothalamic pituitary axis helps to regulate the secretions of cortisol hormone. Now another important hormone called catecholamines. Here we will discuss about the synthesis of catecholamines. In previous lectures, we have discussed about the synthesis of aldosterone hormones, or biosynthesis. Here we will discuss about the synthesis of catecholamines. If you see the synthesis of catecholamines, like previous ones, in this case also, there are some important enzymes catalyze the whole pathway, and it is a 4-step pathway. Mainly 4 different enzymes are involved in the synthesis of catecholamines. Now you can see what are those enzymes. See the pathway for catecholamine synthesis. In this particular pathway, it is a 4-step pathway. The maximum number of enzymes involved here is 4. So what are these 4 different enzymes? One is tyrosine hydroxylase, dopa decarboxylase, dopamine beta hydroxylase, and phenyl ethanolamine and methyl transferase. So all these 4 different enzymes catalyze 4 different reactions, and they produce some intermediate which initiates from the L-tyrosine and with the epinephrine and norepinephrine. Both the epinephrine, norepinephrine along with the dopamines, though they are the intermediate or end product of this biosynthetic pathway, at the same time they act as a catecholamines. So simple thing is, In this synthetic pathway, some specific enzymes are involved. They catalyze specific biochemical reactions and ultimately they produce some intermediate product, right? Like dopamine, norepinephrine and epinephrine. Now, like synthesis of these catecholamine hormones or the like functions of aldosterone or cortisol hormones, the function of catecholamines is also physiologically very important. So what are the most important functions that is carried out by these catecholamine hormones and how these catecholamine hormones acts through? You can see catecholamines also follows the same pathway, that is the second messenger pathway. This is the pathway and these are the membrane receptors, activations of G proteins, formations of cyclic AMP, that is second messengers, and activations of protein kinase, and ultimately phosphorylations leads to the succeeding step of reactions and ultimately leads to the response of cells. Already explained many times. Now, what is the most important functional features of those catecholamines? These are the functional features. You can see this epinephrine and norepinephrines involves in the changes in the rate and force of contractions of heart muscles. Very important. So, at a certain point of time, it needs to improve the contractile property of the heart muscles. Whenever there is a more and more a need of blood supply in the tissue level, it needs a more and more contractions of the heart muscles. In that particular point of time, these catecholamines, mainly epinephrine and norepinephrine, played an important role. You can see increased rate and force of contractions of the heart muscles. That helps to sufficient supply of oxygenated blood at tissue level or cellular level. It also involves with the constrictions of the blood vessels that leads to changes in the blood pressures and the blood vessels. Dilations of the bronchioles. Here, bronchioles is very important because it acts as a passage for the airflow. Stimulations of lipolysis in adipose tissue means, like previous one, it also involves the metabolisms, mainly fat metabolisms. It increases the metabolic rate, dilatations of the pupils. Other than this, you can see inhibition of certain non-essential processes. For example, inhibitions of gastrointestinal secretions and motor activity also controlled by these epinephrine and norepinephrine's. The most important functions that is carried out by dopamine is that may be found in the brains and it involves the control or regulation of neurotransmitter secretions. So these are some of the most important physiological functions of catecholamine hormone. Now let me brief about both the lectures regarding adrenal glands. In first lectures, I tried to explain about the biosynthesis of aldosterone hormones. I explained about the details path of genomic actions of aldosterone hormones and non-genomic actions. At the same time, in first class, I have discussed about some abnormality of aldosterone secretions, hypo and hypersecretions. In today's lectures, I have discussed about the aldosterone hormones and how these renin, angiotensin, aldosterone systems helps in the aldosterone secretions and how this aldosterone helps to maintain several physiological events. After that, I have discussed about the role of cortisol hormones and role of catecholamines. So this is all about the discussion of adrenal cortex and adrenal medulla. Thank you.